Fear not, great people of Minnesota. The day of reckoning and retribution is coming. Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social on January 13, 2026. Days later, a masked Border Patrol agent shot and killed Alex Pretty, an ICU nurse. A week earlier, Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3, was killed. Both white Americans, both without trial, both gunned down by federal agents on the streets of Minneapolis. In response, Democratic Governor Tim Walz deployed the National Guard to protect citizens from their own federal law enforcement. Trump in turn threatened the governor with branding this as insurrection and invoking the Insurrection Act, a law dating back to 1807. Though this sounds like a movie plot, it is not fiction. This is America in January 2026. What began as fulfillment of a campaign promise to secure the border has rapidly escalated into the biggest domestic crisis of the president's second term. Federal enforcement operations, mass deportations, hundreds of thousands of arrests, and the deaths of US citizens in confrontations with federal agents have triggered an unprecedented conflict between the executive branch, the courts, and state authorities. America is fighting itself, and the fight is getting increasingly brutal. Could this situation escalate to the level of civil war? Political instability doesn't stay confined to headlines. It quickly spills into markets. Internal tensions, clashes between federal power and state authority, and growing uncertainty around the rule of law all affect investor confidence, capital flows, and long-term economic stability. Recent events in the United States are a reminder of how fragile even the world's largest economies can become when politics turns volatile. In times like these, understanding global events through an economic lens is no longer optional. That is why I use XTB, an investment platform that helps me track global trends and market reactions using data, not emotions. With XTB, I get access to over 9,100 stocks and ETFs from markets around the world, all in one place, with zero commission up to €100,000 in monthly turnover, then 0.2%. As always, remember that investing involves risk and should be approached responsibly. One of Donald Trump's central campaign promises was combating illegal immigration. He moved to implement it with full force within the first hours of his second term. Border militarization was accompanied by tariff and diplomatic pressure on Mexico and Canada. These actions rapidly reduced illegal crossings, allowing a shift to Phase 2, mass deportations of individuals residing in the United States without authorization. Execution of this task fell to ICE agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, primarily Border Patrol. From the start, agents employed streamlined administrative procedures, conducting arrests and deportations on an expedited basis, often without warrants or court orders. The initial focus was on individuals with criminal records, a group Trump repeatedly invoked in his immigration rhetoric. Gangs of illegal immigrants were blamed for rising rates of serious crimes, including murders and drug trafficking. The speed and scale of federal operations caused arrests and deportations to spike dramatically. This had a desired side effect. It discouraged people from crossing illegally and prompted roughly 2 million undocumented immigrants to leave the country voluntarily, out of fear of arrest. Worth noting, ICE was a small agency, about 10,000 personnel, tasked with the ambitious goal of deporting 1 million detainees in just 1 year. They ultimately deported over 600,000. This overestimation of administrative capacity had serious consequences. As late as June, 56% of Americans supported federal policy. Then things started to unravel. To meet deportation quotas, 12,000 new agents were hired, a 120% increase in 1 year. Due to time constraints, their training was minimal, and candidate vetting was cursory at best. Among those hired were members of right-wing militias like the Proud Boys. Additionally, the scope of arrests expanded dramatically to include immigrants without criminal records. Arrests up 2,500% year over year. People who lived in the country for decades, asylum seekers, individuals in mixed status marriages, and more. Directives prohibiting operations in schools, hospitals, and courthouses were rescinded, and agents increasingly ignored procedures and legal constraints. Crucially, lacking authority over US citizens, they couldn't legally check IDs or make arrests, except under quote reasonable suspicion. These circumstances, combined with federal pressure to hit quota targets, triggered the first crisis situations by mid-2025. Media attention focused on sunny California, where weeks of street riots erupted. This was the response to mass raids that arrested hundreds at a time. The brutality and chaos of these operations escalated tensions, colliding with local dynamics. A large Latino diaspora and conflict with the state's democratic leadership. Effective ICE operations require assistance from police or other agencies with authority over US citizens, cooperation that wasn't always forthcoming. Public perception soared further because ICE agents wore masks, displayed no visible identification, and drove unmarked vehicles. Legal violations multiplied, warrantless entry into residences, unjustified detention of citizens, or green card holders based on racial profiling. There were documented cases of detainees being beaten and held for days, even weeks, before their identities were confirmed. Media coverage highlighted the fates of elderly immigrants deported after 30 or 40 years in the country, and children separated from families. Sporadic deaths of detainees in custody centers from medical causes exacerbated by lack of care poured fuel on the fire. Ultimately, Donald Trump federalized the California National Guard. As a reminder, the National Guard normally answers to state governors, and federal seizure violates state autonomy under the 10th Amendment. Trump deployed California's Guard to the streets of Los Angeles to protect government buildings, mainly ICE offices and detention centers, and assist ICE agents in operations. Over 4,000 Guard troops arrived, joined by 700 Marines. This decision was made over Governor Gavin Newsom's objections and in violation of law, specifically the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits using military forces to enforce civilian law without congressional approval. Federal courts confirmed this assessment in September and December 2025. Nevertheless, the Guard presence moderated behavior by both protesters and ICE agents themselves. Before courts could challenge these actions, Trump federalized and deployed Guard units to additional cities, including Washington, D.C., where they were to restore order by assisting local police. The district's unique status gave the president latitude here. In Chicago, New Orleans, and Portland, courts blocked Guard activation. Trump didn't hide his anger. On the last day of the year, he announced troop withdrawals, but warned that if crime increased, soldiers would return in far greater numbers. In his narrative, the unpopular and illegal use of military forces to assist ICE was reframed as necessary to combat crime, riots, and insurrection. This shift was forced by court rulings. The only exception to Posse Comitatus is the Insurrection Act of 1807, which permits federalizing the Guard to suppress internal rebellion. Trump repeatedly threatened governors that he was prepared to invoke it if they opposed anti-immigration enforcement. So far, he hasn't followed through. Unsurprisingly, deploying the military would be extraordinarily risky politically and would require ironclad justification from the White House. For now, the president has opted to intensify operations by agencies under DHS, using a show of force to break state resistance. He is keeping military intervention in reserve for organized, even armed resistance to ICE and DHS operations, which would give him the justification he needs. Minneapolis, Minnesota was chosen as the site for a showcase demonstration of anti-immigration enforcement. Democratically governed, relatively small, just over 400,000 residents, but designated as, quote, sanctuary city, where immigrant data isn't shared with federal authorities and undocumented individuals access public services. Crucially, the state's longtime governor, Tim Walz, Kamala Harris' running mate in the 2024 campaign, had been accused of incompetence and ignoring reports of massive public fund embezzlement. The allegations centered on fraudulent social programs, such as child nutrition schemes, that allegedly drained anywhere from hundreds of millions to as much as $9 billion from state coffers. Authorities had arrested nearly 100 people involved in the fraud network, most of them Somali. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area is home to roughly 100,000 Somali residents. Theoretically, everything aligned perfectly. A compromised governor, a sanctuary city, large-scale fraud, migrants implicated. When Operation Metro Surge launched in December 2025, Trump referred to the Somali community as, quote, garbage that needed to be thrown out of the country. He invoked controversial Somali-American Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, linking Democratic policies to migrant crime. Initially, several hundred agents were deployed, executing dozens of arrests daily, mainly targeting convicted criminals. But contrary to official narrative, illegal immigrants represented a tiny fraction of the Somali community, just a few hundred people. From mid-December, ICE agents began operating blindly, randomly arresting people on streets, entering homes without cause. Social tensions ignited almost immediately. As the new year begins, the situation in Minnesota deteriorates further. On January 5th and 6th, over 2,000 additional agents arrive in the city, making Operation Metro Surge the largest in the agency's history. The aforementioned lack of agent professionalism and pressure to meet quotas regardless of actual circumstances leads rapidly to tragedy. On January 7th, an ICE agent kills Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old white American woman. Despite freezing cold, residents pour into the streets protesting law enforcement brutality and lawlessness. Local officials demand ICE leave the state. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey uses decidedly unprintable language to that effect, and citizens appeal to police for protection. But police are vastly outnumbered, just 600 officers versus several thousand federal agents. Chaos mounts. Trump orders 1,500 soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division in Alaska to prepare for deployment to the city. On January 24th, another white US citizen is killed. The victim, Alex Pretty, a nurse at a local hospital, shot dead by a Border Patrol agent. Governor Tim Walz orders the National Guard to intervene, securing federal buildings, including ICE offices, and assisting the sheriff's office and police in maintaining public order. Implicitly, this also means protecting residents from unlawful actions by DHS personnel. To de-escalate, soldiers distribute hot drinks and donuts to residents. It is a clever preemptive move against possible federalization by Trump. Meanwhile, in Congress, opposition to the enforcement operations grows, uniting Democrats and Republicans. Calls for credible investigations into the killings are widespread, and several prosecutors resign under pressure and attempts to manipulate proceedings. Democrats threaten to block funding for the Department of Justice, including increased ICE funding, potentially triggering another federal budget shutdown. There are calls to impeach Kristi Noem, the DHS secretary, and state authorities file suit against the federal government for violating the 10th Amendment's protection of state sovereignty. Simultaneously, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, demands that Governor Walz handed over voter registration records and begin cooperating with ICE by abandoning, quote, sanctuary city policies. She argues that without such cooperation, operations will continue with even greater force. She dismisses accusations against federal agents, claiming the victims themselves were at fault. Pretty was accused of terrorism and attempted murder of federal officers within hours of his death. Similar narratives of absolute support for ICE have been expressed since early January by Noem, Greg Bovino, the Border Patrol Chief, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump. Meanwhile, video footage and witness testimony in each case pointed to agents violating all procedures, lacking professionalism, and shooting people. Moreover, US citizens, not immigrants. By late January, the situation in Minnesota had National Guard troops facing off against federal agents, with protests threatening to spark direct confrontation. Support for Donald Trump dropped to a record low, 38%, his worst approval rating of his second term, and his administration's greatest success, curbing illegal immigration, had turned into catastrophe. On average, 60% of Americans opposed ICE methods, versus 40% supporting them. And this is just months before midterm elections. Republican support in Minnesota collapsed so dramatically that their candidates' chances of election fell essentially to zero. Democrats hold a double-digit lead. And so on January 26, Donald Trump abruptly changed course. First, he withdrew his defense of the agents, endorsing credible investigations. Then he spoke with Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Frey, de-escalating federal-state tensions. Thomas Homan, the border czar and longtime border enforcement veteran, was dispatched to Minnesota tasked with bringing ICE's chaotic operations under control. Controversial Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino was removed from operational command. Some agents are to be withdrawn from Minnesota in exchange for local police restoring order to the protests. For now, the situation appears headed toward stabilization, but the underlying problem remains. So why did we open by mentioning the growing risk of civil war? The answer isn't straightforward. In all this chaos, it is not really about the fate of immigrants. Under Barack Obama's administration, roughly 3 million were deported. The problem isn't violent protests or even the deaths of American citizens at the hands of law enforcement. These are certainly serious matters. But remember what happened in American cities in 2020, when George Floyd's death triggered a genuine racial crisis. Black Lives Matter mobilized millions in protests, and riots erupted nationwide with widespread arson and destruction of public property. Interestingly, Tim Walz deployed Guard troops then as well to restore order, acting in opposition to protesting citizens. Today his posture is reversed. Guardsmen are meant to protect residents from unlawful actions by federal agents. Is this pure opportunism on his part? Walz isn't seeking re-election, so he doesn't need to score political points. Trump was president then too, though the conflict didn't target him personally. State police was criticized, not federal agencies. Context matters. In his second term, Donald Trump is directly implementing the blueprint of Project 2025, which pushes the theory of the unitary executive, granting the president virtually unlimited power, unrestrained agency operations, direct control over prosecutorial decisions, firing federal agency leadership at will, ignoring Congress, circumventing court rulings through expansive statutory interpretation. These are all elements of a comprehensive strategy aimed at dismantling the system of constitutional checks and balances designed to protect citizens from oppressive government. Anti-immigration operations reveal in microcosm why anti-authoritarian constraints are necessary. Repeated violations of civil rights, imposing decisions on state authorities, and ultimately the lack of legal accountability for federal officials are eroding the American system, leading toward the abolition of the rule of law. For now, American democracy is being defended in courtrooms, where judges repeatedly strike down presidential decrees. But battle over expanding presidential powers continues. Congress appears powerless, and even if Republicans lose the midterm elections, there is no guarantee the situation will change. The country is governed by executive orders, and the questioning of election legitimacy could mean future results won't be recognized by the White House. Consider one more factor: the Washington administration's lack of professionalism. Prioritizing loyalty to the president over competence breeds chaos and weakens state institutions. This leads to tragedies like those witnessed in Minnesota. The cycle repeats endlessly. In international politics, we observed it during negotiations with Russia and recently in the destructive dispute over Greenland. This won't change, because Donald Trump's authoritarian-like governing style leaves no room for course correction. When existing law ceases to constrain executive power, whether to carry out an order that constitutes a crime becomes solely a matter of individual conscience for whoever must execute it. In a situation where every dissenting view is ruthlessly suppressed, officials are blackmailed, and citizens are intimidated by federal agencies operating with impunity, noble stands become increasingly rare. We know this mechanism from history. One day, sooner or later, there may be a bloody crackdown on protests under the Insurrection Act, and then a society that prizes the Second Amendment may take up arms. Such escalation would be extremely difficult to stop, especially with a president who brooks no opposition at the helm. That is why we should view events in Minneapolis or Los Angeles through the lens of a broader national process. None of these incidents in isolation has the potential to trigger civil war, but the entire cycle, combined with lack of professionalism, authoritarian governance, and increasingly bitter state-federal conflict, indeed does possess that potential. What we are witnessing now may be merely temporary de-escalation, but further internal conflicts could repeat in coming months. Let's watch them very carefully, particularly regarding restrictions on civil rights, because that element might be the ultimate spark.